Hi and welcome to the Retribution Paladin Essentials Guide updated for patch 7.1.5. My name's Thete, a high-end raiding Retribution Paladin of many years experience, and this is the follow-up to my hugely well-received Legion Essentials Guide. The reason for this update is that a few things have changed since the launch of Legion, and I wanted to make sure that my content is up to date. With that in mind, if ever you're in doubt, just click the card in the top right which will take you to my Retribution Paladin playlist, which only contains up-to-date guides and discussions on Retribution, including some more specialised and advanced content. The first thing to point out is this guide is suitable for everyone from raw beginner to the more veteran player. However, because you may be interested in certain sections, I've put chapter timestamps in the description below. I'm going to assume that you are level 110 and have the Ashbringer artifact weapon. In addition, some topics warrant detailed discussion, and I tend to cover these in more specialised videos which may also be found in the Retribution playlist. So this first chapter is on abilities. Retribution Paladin damage is mostly based around using some abilities to generate holy power, and then some more powerful abilities to spend that holy power. There are a small number of abilities that have nothing to do with it, and that will be covered at the appropriate point. Your three main ways of generating holy power are Wake of Ashes, Blade of Justice, and Crusader Strike. Wake of Ashes is the special ability obtained from the Ashbringer. However, once you have the Ashes to Ashes major trait, more on that in the Ashbringer chapter, then it will also generate 5 holy power for you. This should not be used when you already have several holy power, but does want to be used whenever it's available as quickly as it's practical to do so. If you already have 3 or more holy power when Wake of Ashes is available, spend first and then use Wake of Ashes. Wake of Ashes has a 12-yard range and does its damage in a frontal cone. This means you have to be roughly facing as many enemies as possible when using it. Although the 12-yard range makes it sound like it can be used at moderate range, be very careful because you will cry bitter tears if you use it and weren't quite in range. This will cost you a lot of damage and holy power. Blade of Justice has a 12-yard range but requires a target, so it's not possible to be out of range and waste it, as the ability simply wouldn't work. This ability generates 2 holy power and is often used while running into a new enemy due to the range. Crusader Strike is a melee range ability which generates 1 holy power. However, it has 2 charges, which is useful for smoothing out your rotation. In general terms, your priority of holy power builders is Wake of Ashes if you have fewer than 3 holy power, Crusader Strike if you have 2 charges of it, Blade of Justice, and then Crusader Strike if there's only 1 charge and nothing else available. As these abilities exist mainly to generate holy power, it goes without saying that we don't really want to use them if doing so would overcap holy power. We can only hold 5 holy power at any one time, and if using these abilities would mean that we would waste the holy power they're generating, it might be better to think about spending instead. Do note that some wastage of holy power will inevitably occur, especially through Wake of Ashes and the 4 set bonus from the tier 19 Nighthold armor set, but this needs to be kept down to a minimum. When it comes to spending holy power, you have 2 default choices, Templar's Verdict and Divine Storm. They both deal holy damage. Templar's Verdict is a pure single target ability that deals a lot of damage. It's going to be used on a pure single target fight or where there's adds around you but they don't matter, so you need to focus the boss. Divine Storm, if you've got most of the traits on your Ashbringer filled out, will be a DPS increase on as few as 2 targets. However, if the Ashbringer is in the early stages of development, then it may only be a DPS increase on 3 targets. You will have to check this for yourself by comparing the tooltips for Templar's Verdict and Divine Storm. If Divine Storm says that its damage is more than half of Templar's Verdict, then you can use it on 2 targets. If not, then you should wait for 3 targets before you use Divine Storm. Most of our damage comes from our holy power spenders, so we need to get out as many of these as possible, especially whilst under the effects of DPS cooldowns such as Avenging Wrath, potions, heroism, trinket procs, or anything like that. Judgment. This is a ranged ability tied very strongly to our mastery. Using this ability deals holy damage, but more importantly, places a debuff on our target plus 1 other nearby mob. This debuff causes those targets to take extra damage from our holy power spenders. The amount of extra damage is determined by our mastery value. In short, you want to make sure that you have the debuff on your target before using holy power spenders. More details on how to do this will be covered in the section on dealing damage. Avenging Wrath is our main DPS ability on a 2-minute cooldown by default, and its use is extremely important. Because we deal so much of our damage under the effects of Avenging Wrath, or the Talented Crusade, we need to try and use it when we'll get the most benefit. This will ideally coincide with the use of other DPS cooldowns such as Heroism, using potions, etc. It may also include using it during a crucial burst phase of a fight, such as the Heart phase on Il'gynoth in Emerald Nightmare. What you must avoid is having periods of inactivity while the ability is active, as this will massively reduce your DPS. It's also worth thinking about appropriate times to use Avenging Wrath and rethinking as circumstances change. For example, on the Mythic Odin fight in Trial of Valor, I used to use my second application on Himdall as he lagged behind Herja. However, after the fight was being farmed, the raid DPS increased, which meant that this wasn't necessary, and some of the Avenging Wrath ended up being wasted. So now I save it for the start of Phase 2, where I can get the full benefit. In terms of deciding how long you can afford to delay using Avenging Wrath, remember the rule that you should almost never delay if doing so would cost you an extra application. For example, in a 5-minute fight, you should expect to use Avenging Wrath comfortably 3 times. If you end up only using it twice, or don't get the full duration out of your third use, then it may well be that you delayed too long. Now, when it comes to defensives, we have a number. Divine Shield is our immunity bubble. It's on a very long cooldown unless you have it talented, but it should protect you from any and all damage. However, bear in mind, if there is a large amount of damage related to a mechanic in a fight that is intended to kill you come what may, bubble will not protect you. A classic example of this is Mixed Elements on Guam in Trial of Valor, where if you get the 2 debuffs, you are going to die. Blessing of Protection works in a similar way to Divine Shield, only protects you from physical damage, not all damage, but it can be placed on another friendly player. This makes it useful for placing on casters or healers if they might need to stand still and either deal their damage or do lots of burst healing, whilst physical damage would otherwise be raging around them. It can also be used if someone is being attacked. For example, the Skittish in a Mythic Plus dungeon. Again, you can use it on someone who's a bit squishy. Lay on Hands does a very large heal, equal to your own health, but it has a very long cooldown. It is an emergency heal which can be used on yourself or another player as you see fit. Do bear in mind that on a raid encounter, you are likely only to be able to use this once, so make sure that to not use it would mean someone's death, or you're fairly confident someone would die if you did not use it on them. Now, these 3 defensive abilities, Divine Shield, Blessing of Protection, and Lay on Hands, all place a debuff called Forbearance on the target. Forbearance, if your Ashbringer is fully traded, lasts 20 seconds and does not allow any of the other 2 to be used on the same target until that Forbearance has faded. So, for example, if you use Divine Shield on yourself, you will not be able to use Blessing of Protection or Lay on Hands on yourself until that Forbearance has faded. This is quite important if, when particularly using Lay on Hands, if you decide one of the tanks is in mortal danger and you decide to use your Lay on Hands on them, be very, very careful. If it's a protection paladin, you might want to avoid it because they might be planning on using, say, their own Divine Shield very soon, and you placing Lay on Hands on them will prevent them doing so because they'll have Forbearance active. So make sure you communicate if applying either Blessing of Protection or Lay on Hands on another player is likely to cause trouble with another paladin in the party. Shield of Vengeance is a funny one as defensives go, because it can be used aggressively. Shield of Vengeance gives you an absorb shield. If the absorb shield is consumed within the time, then it will deal holy damage equal to the amount it absorbed. However, if it is not consumed, then it will deal no damage at all. So when using this, you ideally want to have the entire shield consumed. Sometimes you might use this on a powerful ability to protect yourself. You're using it defensively, but it doesn't quite consume the whole shield. In this case, you might want to see if there's any patch of fire nearby that you can stand in just to finish it off and deal damage to the boss. However, it has to be said that this ability should first and foremost be used defensively. It's no good using it offensively, deliberately taking damage that you didn't have to take just to do damage to the boss, and then half a minute later you die to something that actually Shield of Vengeance would have protected you from. But in reality, the number of times you actually need to use Shield of Vengeance purely defensively is frankly quite few. You will mostly use this aggressively. Odin is a great fight for this because you can use this almost all the time on cooldown, and there's almost always some damage that you can be taking to trigger it. When it comes to utility abilities, Greater Blessings have changed. We now have two. The Greater Blessing of Wisdom, which will provide health and mana back. We can place this on a single target in our raid or party. You should place it on whoever wants it the most. You would most likely expect to put this on a healer. Greater Blessing of Kings provides a small self-refreshing absorb shield. Again, you can only place one of these. You can place it on a single player. Again, whoever is likely to want it the most, the default choice may well be a tank. Blessing of Freedom can be placed on yourself or another player. It has a relatively short cooldown and makes the target immune to movement impairing effects, and also removes roots and snares that may be active on them at the time. Notes that it does not remove stuns. Cleanse Toxins removes poisons and diseases from targets. It doesn't get that much use in raids. However, I do tend to use it in dungeons now and then, in particular on the trash leading up to Xavius in Darkheart Thicket, where the tank can end up getting some quite nasty diseases on them. Divine Steed is our movement speed increase. It boosts our movement by 100% for 3 seconds, puts us on a charger. That's just one more reason not to have a Tauren as a paladin. This can be used if you want to move from one target to another really quickly, if you want to move out of a large ground effect very quickly, or if you've moved out for a mechanic and want to move back in to get DPS on as quickly as possible. Hammer of Justice is our default single target stun. It cannot generally be used on bosses, and it may not be usable on some mobs on a boss fight. Rebuke is our interrupt. In line with other melee, we get an interrupt on a relatively short cooldown, which may be required as part of an interrupt rotation on some boss fights. When it comes to talents, Blizzard have had a stated aim of making all talents viable in different situations. So let's go through what has changed here. So in terms of the first row, we have Final Verdict, Execution Sentence, and Consecration. The idea behind these was always Final Verdict is useful when you have a mix of single target and AoE because it sort of works well for both. Execution Sentence is for pure single target, and Consecration is for when you've got lots of AoE. Now, Consecration and Execution Sentence have been buffed to the point where, indeed, if you are doing dungeons, you might well now want to take Consecration. It can be very powerful, even if you can't keep the mobs in it for the full duration. You'll be able to plonk it down regularly. It would still work a lot better if it moved with you, but it doesn't. Execution Sentence has also been buffed. However, it is not going to be always the standard choice on a single target fight. You will, I'm afraid, have to simulate your own character to decide whether Execution Sentence is worth taking on a pure single target fight. When I simmed my own character, it was not going to be. It does very much depend upon the state of your Ashbringer, as well as other stats that you have in your gear. Final Verdict will remain the standard choice for flexible situations where you need to be able to do lots of good single target burst, but also be able to do AoE burst as well. It's the safe choice. When it comes to the second row, Fires of Justice and Zeal both directly buff our Crusader Strike. Which one will be best for you will again depend on your own individual character. It's not circumstances that determine it, it is your character. And unfortunately, it's been a feature of Legion, well, it's unfortunate for some people, that you, I'm afraid, have to simulate your character to decide which is best for you. Fires of Justice is generally one that scales pretty well with haste. It also is more likely to be effective if you have the Legendary Cloak, but that is not a guarantee, and as I say, you will have to sim it. Greater Judgment places 2 extra debuffs of the Judgment on your targets. It is useful, therefore, for AoE situations. It has some single target benefit in that it does guaranteed crit damage on targets above 50%. Again, you may need to sim yourself to see whether this would be better. Some people like using this in dungeons, for example. Some people like using it even on boss fights where there are lots of important adds. In terms of the third tier, Fist of Justice modifies our Hammer of Justice. In other words, it reduces the cooldown. Now, this has changed in patch 7.1.5 in terms of how it does it. It now reduces the cooldown based on how much holy power you've spent, not how many holy power spenders you have used. It is a slight nerf unless you use Justicar's Vengeance, but as a developed Ashbringer is unlikely to get much use out of Justicar's Vengeance, we can consider that we won't get quite as much benefit out of this talent as we used to, but it is still the solid talent to take in most situations. Repentance is a crowd control that we cast with a very short cast time on some targets. It does not work on all types of mob. Even mobs that can be stunned are not necessarily all covered. It does damage to the mob while it remains stunned. And the cooldown of the ability is shorter than the duration, which means if someone breaks it out by accident, there's a good chance you will be able to reapply it. However, in most situations, there is no need to crowd control a single mob in this way, so we very rarely use it, whether in raids or dungeons. It is not a choice that I would recommend. Blinding Light is really useful against packs of mobs, particularly ones that are affected by the Disorientate. It can be used to prevent casting. However, do bear in mind if you're using it in this way, then when they come out of the Disorientate, they may all decide to cast at the same time. And if it's on the tank may not thank you. So we have to be a little bit careful about using it. It also deals damage. But that doesn't necessarily mean we can use it with damage in mind, because it would still remain our low priority in terms of the damage. But it is a useful one to take in dungeons potentially, as well as on any fight where you've got lots of mobs around that can be crowd controlled. The fourth tier is affecting our Blade of Justice. All of these are viable in different situations. Virtue's Blade and Blade of Wrath is very similar to the Crusader Strike modifiers in that you have to simulate your character to determine which is best, and also which is best in different situations. Generally speaking, you will find that Blade of Wrath is better for people who have lower levels of crit, Virtue's Blade for people who have higher levels of crit. But one commonly asked question I keep getting is, at what crit value should I switch to Virtue's Blade? It doesn't come down to how much crit you have alone. It's a balance of everything, which is why the only way to tell is to use simulation. Divine Hammer is really good in AoE situations. As such, just like with Consecration, it's a really good one to take with dungeons. It was a really good one to take with dungeons, in my opinion, at the start of Legion, and then it sort of fell down a little bit. But for 7.1.5, I think it's back up to being, use this in dungeons. I would strongly recommend it, where trash is more important, or any boss fight where the AoE takes precedence over single targets, say, then you would take Divine Hammer. Justicar's Vengeance, without a fully developed Ashbringer, can actually be a good DPS increase if you get, for example, a Divine Purpose proc or against a stunned mob. However, as you fill up your Ashbringer, you will note that it falls behind compared to Templar's Verdict. It uses 5 holy power as opposed to 3 as well, so even if it does slightly more damage, it's not as holy power efficient. Therefore, it's not an ability to take for its DPS value. However, for solo situations and potentially PvP, you can use it for the heal. It will do as much healing to you as you do damage with it, and because it does extra damage against a stunned mob, you can stun a mob, use this against them, and heal yourself up. Very good for soloing very tough elite mobs. Eye for an Eye is the standard defensive talent to take for group PvE. It protects you from a certain amount of physical damage, but also if anyone hits you in melee, it will counterattack and deal damage back to them. That makes it useful for PvP, but it also makes it useful for some solo content where you might have lots of mobs attacking you. Putting Eye for an Eye on will mean they all get a lot of damage dealt back to them, as well as protecting you from some of the physical damage as well. It's also really useful on a lot of raid boss fights where there'll be physical damage that you can just use to reduce. It's the only ability that we can possibly have that reduces damage by a certain amount. Word of Glory is not a particularly effective one in my view. It has been potentially interesting in dungeons. It uses holy power. It has a 1 minute cooldown, although it has a charge system, so 2 charges. And it does a reasonable amount of healing for the 3 holy power, you could argue. In a tight dungeon situation where everyone's low on health, you could give a couple of quick blasts of this, and because in a dungeon people do tend to be grouped up quite a lot, it's going to hit everyone in all likelihood. It can actually affect up to 5 other people, including yourself. Unfortunately, in raids, because it's centered on you, you would only be getting any use out of it against other melee, so it's only really useful to use in a raid if there's lots of melee taking lots of damage. And because you're using holy power for it, it's a massive DPS loss. You have to ask yourself, is it really necessary? In most cases, if melee are going to be taking necessary damage like that, there will be a healer assigned to deal with that. As such, if you're going to take it at all, I would only recommend it for dungeons, and I don't really recommend it for dungeons either, but the choice is yours. When it comes to the level 90 row, Divine Intervention has traditionally been quite useful while Legion has been out by massively reducing the cooldown on your Divine Shield. However, it has unfortunately been nerfed a little. It now only reduces it by a minute, so it will still have a fairly long 4-minute cooldown, meaning that Divine Intervention, unless you happen to use it quite early on in a fight, you are probably still only going to be able to use Divine Shield once, which means the reduction in cooldown for most fights, not all, is not that useful. Where it will really come in useful is the cheat death effects, whereby Divine Shield will automatically trigger if an effect would ordinarily kill you. Instead, what it'll do is place you on 20% health and trigger Divine Shield, provided Divine Shield was not already on cooldown, and also provided you did not have Forbearance, because if you have Forbearance, then Divine Shield can't trigger. However, the nerf to the cooldown reduction means that Divine Intervention will not look as attractive as it once did. Cavalier gives us an extra charge of Divine Steed. This is our ability for our movement speed. This could be really useful on a fight where there's lots of movement required, or where you have to move very quickly out of a situation and then want to move very quickly back into it. Judgment of Light is a new talent for 7.1.5, or at least it is for Retribution. It had already existed as a talent for Protection Paladins. This is an ability that we can place on a mob, and then any friendly targets who attack it, including yourself, can get a heal off it. You're restricted to 1 heal per second, and it effectively has 40 charges on it. It's a nice little consideration if you don't need Divine Intervention and you don't feel you need Cavalier on a fight. The amount of healing you'll get from it is not necessarily going to save lives, but over the course of a fight, if used regularly, may well be interesting enough to take. Finally, the last talent row, there is no real choice at all, unlike all the others. Divine Purpose may have some use while you are still developing your Ashbringer. However, as soon as you have got points in Wrath of the Ashbringer, which extends the duration of Avenging Wrath, you should be taking Crusade. There is no real argument about that. So for group PvE, once you've got a well-developed Ashbringer, Crusade is the only option. Divine Purpose does not really have any interaction with any of our other abilities. There is no reason to take this. The only time when Divine Purpose would potentially allow you to do more damage is if you use Avenging Wrath very badly. In other words, you keep using it, but then not having a lot of uptime on your DPS. But the answer to that is to make sure that you use your Avenging Wrath cooldowns much more sensibly. Holy Wrath has never been a talent that has been very useful. There were times during the beta when people thought maybe there might be some niche uses when you can do something cunning, but so far this has not been the case, and if anyone has any thoughts for the Nighthold bosses, they're keeping it to themselves for now. But beyond a potentially niche use for it, Holy Wrath remains useless for group PvE. So as I said, for this talent row there is only one choice, Crusade. That's the one you should take. For dungeons, for raids, for solo content, I would advise it for all forms of PvE. So when it comes to dealing damage on any class, there is no longer such a thing as a rotation. We have what is called a priority list, an action priority list. And this is generally speaking what ours looks like, without going into too much complicated detail.
So what will generally serve you well? The top of the list there is using a spender if you have a Divine Purpose proc or a Fires of Justice proc which is about to fade. Now, of course, I've already advised that for general purposes, you probably won't be taking Divine Purpose, and you may or may not take Fires of Justice. But if you have either of those and they proc and the proc is about to fade, then you should use a spender because you don't want to let procs go to waste. The next priority is using a spender if you're on 5 Holy Power. Of course, if you're on 5 Holy Power, you can't build anymore, so this is the time to spend. The next one is Execution Sentence if you have it. If you take this talent, it's sometimes going to be good, sometimes not, but if it's going to be good, it will only be good if you are going to use it on cooldown. The next one is using a spender if Wake of Ashes is about to come off cooldown. So even if you have builders available and you wouldn't overcap, if Wake of Ashes is about to come off cooldown, you want to be using that as soon as you can. You don't want to delay too much. So make sure you use a spender so that you don't overcap unnecessarily on Wake of Ashes. The next priority, of course, is Wake of Ashes, but only if when you spend after it, you will be hitting a target with a Judgment debuff. So you want to make sure that either the Judgment debuff on the target still has at least 2 seconds to go, or that you would be able to reapply Judgment. The next set of priorities continues with the Holy Power builders. So Crusader Strike if you have 2 charges of it. We don't ideally want Crusader Strike on 2 charges. We want to keep one of them on cooldown, but only of course if you won't overcap, so you need to have fewer than 5 Holy Power. The next in the priority list would be Blade of Justice, but of course for this you want fewer than 4 Holy Power, otherwise you'd be overcapping. The next one is Judgment. Generally, of course, the priority of Judgment can move around because you want to make sure that Judgment is available on your target. But sometimes, especially when you have lots of haste due to Crusade and Heroism, you might find that you can use Judgment much more frequently than is necessary to keep the debuff on the target. At this point, this is where it fits in the priority list. You don't want to be spamming it just because it's off cooldown. After this would be Consecration. Now this would be for a single target fight. We might actually take Consecration for things like dungeons, so we might find ourselves in a single target situation with Consecration, and this is the point to use it there. Now, if Avenging Wrath is active, the next one would be to use a spender after all this, but remember, Crusade has a slightly different priority, which I'm going to go on to next. After that is Crusader Strike if you only have 1 charge left. After that is a spender. If there's absolutely nothing else to do, use a spender. And after that, if you've taken the talent Blinding Light and there's nothing you can use in the unlikely event of that, you might as well use Blinding Light. It does do damage. Now when it comes to 2 target cleave, the key thing to check for is how much damage does your Divine Storm do compared to your Templar's Verdict. As I mentioned earlier on, if it does more than half of Templar's Verdict damage, then you can be using it on 2 targets. So your 2 target cleave is much the same as your single target DPS rotation, only you're going to substitute Divine Storm for Templar's Verdict. If you've regularly got 2 targets available, you may also want to consider using Divine Hammer as opposed to Blade of Wrath or Virtue's Blade. It is worth simulating it for your character as always with all your talent choices, but it's very common for even 2 targets for Divine Hammer to be a DPS increase. Now when it comes to AoE fights, our talent choices are quite open indeed. You would almost certainly be taking Consecration as well as Divine Hammer. You may also want to take Greater Judgment. Blinding Light could also be useful for if you get any second of downtime, because you can use that to do reasonable damage on any mobs if there's enough of them around you. Do bear in mind with Consecration, of course, that it is fixed. So if the mobs are likely to be moving around a lot, then it becomes less useful, but it has now been buffed to the point where you would still probably want to take it if AoE is a feature of most of the thing you're going to be doing on that encounter. When it comes to opening the DPS as a Retribution Paladin, there are a couple of schools of thought. Now I'm going to take for this an assumption that you're about to pull a boss, whether in a dungeon or a raid. It varies considerably when you're doing trash, where the normal sequence can work. So usually when you're about to pull a boss, an important boss, then you're going to pre-pot. Now the way I pull is I use Blade of Justice as I run in because it's got a 12-yard range. I then use Crusader Strike as I get within melee range of it. I then use Judgment and Crusade at the same time, and then I start spending. I use a spender and then Wake of Ashes and then spend, another builder, spend, and so on. And I stick to a priority of making sure that I am spending as soon as I can. I don't use the normal priority at this point because I want to build those crusade stacks. That means until I get full stacks, I'm not going to build past 3 holy power. If I've got 3 holy power, I am spending it. Of course, I also have to make sure that the judgment debuff is active on the target. Now, some people favour using Wake of Ashes first, and then using Judgment and Crusade, and then spending, and then doing the same sort of priority that I have just described. People will argue maths-wise which one is best and why, but when it comes down to it, if you look at the top parsers of any Retribution Paladins on any fights, you will see a mix of people using either opening. I preferred my particular opening sequence because one of the legendaries I have is Liadrian's Fury Unleashed, and it allowed me to make sure that I didn't waste any of the holy power generated by that ring. What I would suggest is that you try both out, give them a fair crack, make sure that you can try them out on a training dummy, and just decide which for you feels the most comfortable. The one that feels the most comfortable, inevitably the one that will do the most DPS for you.
So when it comes to stats and gearing, I'm first of all going to point out that there is no overall stat priority for Retribution Paladins. It varies from Paladin to Paladin. I'll try and explain a little why. First of all, what I want to do is to explain our stats. So our primary stat is Strength. This basically increases the power of all our abilities. And then we have the secondary stats of Haste, Crit, Mastery and Versatility. Haste reduces the cooldown on our abilities. Because we are a cooldown based class, our holy power builders have cooldowns. That means the higher our haste, the more of those we can get in, the more spenders we can use, the more DPS we can do. Crit obviously increases the regularity of crits that we get with our abilities. When an ability crit, it does double damage. The higher our crit, the more frequently this will happen, but also the more consistently that this will happen, which is also useful. Consistency is very important when doing progress on bosses, particularly where there's a high DPS check. Mastery buffs our spenders as long as the judgment debuff is active on our target. Now, a lot of people think therefore Mastery should be really good for us because it's buffing our Divine Storm and our Templar's Verdict, and when it comes down to it, our Execution Sentence, and those are our biggest damage dealing abilities. But in actual fact, the way it's tuned, Mastery is actually consistently our lowest priority stat. That's not to make it a bad stat. A lot of people describe it as a very bad stat. It's not. It's just not as good as the others as a result. Finally, Versatility, which is a fairly boring stat, but it does what it says on the tin. It increases your damage by an overall flat percentage, and it reduces your damage taken by another percentage. Now, in terms of how to favour these, as I said, you are always better off simulating yourself and regularly simulating yourself when you get new gear so that you can always know which stats you want to be aiming for. However, if you don't want to do that, you will generally be safe prioritising crit and haste. Those are generally the ones we want. When it comes to mastery and versatility, if any one of those two gets left far behind, they will suddenly start simming very highly. So on my character, for example, versatility is actually my highest stat. It's not crit and it's not haste. But the reason for that is because I have so little of it. When one secondary stat gets left behind, it increases in value. Because as you get more of a secondary stat, getting another 500 of it, let's say, is not as valuable as getting 500 of something else. Think about it proportionally. If I've got 3,000 crit, getting another 500 is going to increase it by about 17%. But if I've only got 500 versatility, increasing that by 500 increases it by 100%. Now, I've said before, and if you've watched any of my guides before, I say this, there is no stat priority for Retribution Paladins. I must make that really, really clear. However, I will give one here purely for people who, for whatever reason, do not want to simulate their own character to get their own stat weights. It will not steer you hideously wrong, but bear in mind you are not doing the best for your character if you just stick to a single stat priority, and especially when it's a general one like this. But what I'm going to suggest is crit and haste are your most important ones, followed by versatility, followed by mastery. In terms of general gearing, we're about to enter the part of the expansion where we will begin to get tier armor sets. Tier 19 drops from Nighthold. There are 6 pieces to this set, but we only need 4 of them to get the maximum effect from it. There is a 2 set bonus for wearing 2 pieces of it, and there's a 4 set bonus for wearing 4. The reason why there are 6 available is because it is possible to have legendaries that occupy slots that otherwise would be taken up by the tier 19. In the case of Retribution Paladins, there is a legendary cloak and there are legendary shoulders which also occupy the tier 19 pieces. The other tier 19 pieces on offer are chest, helm, gloves and legs. Now for a Retribution Paladin, there is no legendary chest, gloves or legs. There is a legendary helm, but it's very poor quality for raids. You would not ideally want to take it. So generally speaking, what I would suggest is, in terms of looking forward to legendaries, if you don't seem to be acquiring tier 19 very quickly, or there's a lot of pressure in your raid group, I would try and focus on avoiding the cloak and the shoulders, because if you had those legendaries and you didn't have any others, you'd want to wear them there. So I would generally go for the helm, the legs, the gloves and the chest, for that reason only. Now in terms of the set bonuses for the tier 19, the 2 set bonus means that our holy power spending attacks deal 10% more damage. That's just a passive effect. It's not going to change our style of play or anything like that. Our holy power spenders are what we want to use as much as possible anyway, so this just increases the damage that they will do. The 4 set bonus on the side of it is quite annoying, but it's also quite a powerful one, so we do want to get the 4 set bonus. It means that holy power generating abilities, so that's your Crusader Strike, Wake of Ashes, Blade of Justice, have a 20% chance to generate another holy power. Now the problem with this, of course, is imagine yourself on 4 holy power and use a Crusader Strike. That will get you to 5 holy power. Let's say this effect procs, it's going to generate another holy power which will go to waste because you can't store more than 5. This is the annoying side of it. It could lead to overcapping on holy power. However, this might get you to think, well, what we should do then is not use Crusader Strike on 4, we shouldn't use Blade of Justice on 3, and so on. Always reduce the number of holy power we have before we'll use one of these builders, so that we don't overcap. Doing this will lead to an overall DPS loss. You are actually far better just carrying on with your rotation as normal, completely ignoring this set bonus, because over the course of a fight, we'll still end up gaining from it. We won't overcap that much. We'll end up losing damage if we try to avoid overcapping at all. Accept the fact that it's going to cause us to overcap. It's still a powerful set bonus in terms of the amount of overall damage we will get out of it. Now when it comes to trinkets, again, I am going to caution about item level. The trinkets I talk about as being good will not be as good if you're very low item level and you've got access to lesser ones that are much higher item level. This is why it's important to simulate yourself. However, I'm going to talk in general terms. In general terms, the only solid change that comes with patch 7.1.5 is to Swarming Plague Hive. This is a caster trinket that you are not able to coin, but it drops off Nethendra, the very first boss in Emerald Nightmare. Some paladins have been able to get hold of this either by being given it by a caster who doesn't want it, or from a master loot situation. It has done decent damage for Retribution Paladins. However, in patch 7.1.5, it will not. Changes are coming that will stop it doing decent damage. So if you've got it equipped, when the patch comes out, change it for something else. In terms of what we ideally want, faulty countermeasure is of course our BIS trinket. Nothing changes about faulty countermeasure when the patch comes out. However, when Nighthold comes out, there is something else which I'll go on to in a minute. If you have a very low item level faulty countermeasure, but you've got a much higher item level Horn of Valor, it may well be that the Horn of Valor is the better one to use. If you don't have a faulty countermeasure at all, a good Horn of Valor will be very good as well. They both line up with our Crusade or Avenging Wrath. Just remember, you must not use faulty countermeasure and Horn of Valor at the same time, because the on-use effect won't work at the same time. So you use one or the other, whichever one is best. To go with it, there are trinkets that are decent. There's Memento from Maw of Souls, which is good if you've got it at high item level. It often does a little better than its Sims as well. However, I would recommend a good, solid, high-level stat stick. One that's got your primary stat on it and secondary stats. There are various ones that drop. The most reliable one to try to get would be a one that drops off Odin in Trial of Valor. I've got a high item level one that has crit on it. Crit is great, versatility is great. Haste is decent, especially if you've got the legendary cloak. Mastery less so, probably steer clear if it's got mastery. unless it's an extremely high item level compared with your average item level. Now, I mentioned Nighthold. Now, it's worth talking about the trinkets that are going to become available in Nighthold. There are essentially 5. Now, one of the main problems with the trinkets in Emerald Nightmare is they were all actually pretty poor. You would take them if they were very high item level compared to others that you could get, but I have never used any of the ones from Emerald Nightmare because I've always had something better from dungeons or world quests. But the ones we've got, there is one trinket that we are absolutely going to want. It drops off the penultimate boss, Elisand. It is called Convergence of Fates. This gives our attacks a chance to reduce the remaining cooldown on Avenging Wrath by 5 seconds. For Retribution Paladins, it has got what is called a 4.2 proc per minute. What that means is if you are in combat and you're in constant combat doing your rotation, then an average of 4.2 times a minute, this thing will proc. What that means is realistically, as long as you're not going to have lots of downtime in a fight, you can expect your Avenging Wrath or Crusade to go from having a 2-minute cooldown to roughly, I'll say roughly, 1 minute 20 cooldown. And because we load so much damage into our Avenging Wrath, this is where we do our damage, this makes it an extremely powerful trinket. You want to get this at all costs. You must coin Elisand whenever you do her on any level, on any mode. You absolutely want this trinket at all costs. It changes a great deal of things. One of the big things it changes is as soon as you get that trinket, Faulty Countermeasure and Horn of Valor all of a sudden are not as good. They no longer line up with your Avenging Wrath. Because your Avenging Wrath is no longer on a 2-minute cooldown, it's shorter. Which means you'll only be able to use it every second Avenging Wrath. And that weakens it massively. Massively. At this point, I would recommend the good solid stat stick. I would combine Convergence of Fates with a high level stat stick. If you've got a very high level trinket such as, say, Eye of Command from Karazhan for pure single target fights, sure, that would be pretty good. If you've got a very high level Memento from Maw of Souls, sure, okay, you can combine it with that. That'll be decent. But generally speaking, I would not advise any other trinket than a high item level stat stick, again trying to steer clear of mastery. Now, in terms of the other trinkets that are available, all of them at the moment sim for me quite poorly, but we have to bear a couple of things in mind. Sims are a model. It could be that they're refined with much more data when these things go live. However, the only other trinket that might be feasible is Draft of Souls, which drops off Gul'dan, who is the final boss. Now, the reason why I'm not going to say I'd advise to get this is, first of all, for me it is simming very poorly indeed. Pretty much as badly as the other 3 available, which I'm not even going to bother with. And it's both for single target. It will do better for AoE or cleave type situations. What it does is it's a trinket with haste on it. It's got a lot of haste on it. And it's an on-use trinket with a 2-minute cooldown. And what you can do with this is it says, enters a fell crazed rage, dealing certain amount of shadow damage to random nearby enemy every quarter of a second for 3 seconds. So you get 12 uses out of this. You can't move or use abilities during your rage. So you're not able to use any abilities. You're not able to use your rotation for this 3 seconds. You're not able to move for this 3 seconds. Which might make it a bit of a problem in a dungeon when you try to use it on trash and then the tank, like that arsehole that they are, will move all the stuff away from you. The other reason I'm cautioning against this is even if it seems that it's actually decent for us or it might be an upgrade for you, there are some classes for whom it is a very obvious upgrade. So we would be quite low down on the priority list anyway. So that's it with trinkets. So just to summarise, what I would strongly recommend is get Convergence of Fates as soon as you can. Combine Convergence of Fates with a high level stat stick. Draft of Souls may well be useful, so watch this space. I will obviously update if ever it becomes considered to be a good trinket. I will talk about that in an update video. So when it comes to legendaries, prior to patch 7.1.5, there were 8 legendaries we could potentially get, but only 2 of them gave us a reliable increase to our output. With patch 7.1.5, there are 5 legendaries that will now give us a reliable increase to our DPS. And these are Ashes to Dust, which is a new shoulder. There are 2 new legendaries, of course, coming out with this patch. We also have Liadrin's Fury Unleashed, as we had before. We have Whisper of the Nathrazim, as we had before. We have Chain of Thrain, which is a legendary we had before, but it did not increase our damage. Now it does. And we have Kil'jaeden's Burning Wish, which is a new trinket. Cephas's Secret has the potential to increase our damage. It may be more useful in dungeons and raids, because to get any damage benefit from it, we have to be able to either apply a crowd control to something or an interrupt to something. These are some fights you can, some fights you can't, and whether or not you can on a reliable basis, again, depends on your assignment. So I'm going to consider Cephas's Secret to be better than in patch 7.1.5, but still not a reliable damage output legendary. So before we look at some simulations to see how powerful each of the 5 output legendaries are, let's go through what they do. So beginning with the legendaries that increased our output before, the first one, the Cloak, Whisper of the Nathrazim. Whenever we use Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm, we get a buff. It only lasts for 4 seconds, but if we use a Templar's Verdict or a Divine Storm within that time, then it will do extra damage. Now it used to do 25% extra damage, now it's going to do 15% extra damage, so it has been nerfed, but it is still a very nice DPS increase. Liadrin's Fury Unleashed is a ring. What this does is when your Avenging Wrath is active, and that includes Crusade, then you gain holy power periodically. Before patch 7.1.5, it was every 2.5 seconds. After the patch, it's going to be every 4 seconds, so that's a nerf as well, but it is still a very nice DPS output. In terms of the Chain of Thrain, which is a legendary that was useless to us before, now what it will do is increase our Avenging Wrath damage by 20%. This also applies to Crusade. What it means is that we are going to be doing much more damage during Avenging Wrath with this legendary. In terms of the new ones, Ashes to Dust is a shoulder. What this will do is when you use Wake of Ashes, any enemies hit by it will also take 15% increased damage from you for 6 seconds. So it is empowering the dots you're putting onto your mobs when you hit it with Wake of Ashes, making it much more important to hit as many mobs as possible, especially in an AoE situation. The final one, Kil'jaeden's Burning Wish, is a trinket. This has some secondary stats as well as our primary stat on it. In terms of the effect, it's an on-use ability which does AoE damage. So you can see it's probably going to be of more use in AoE than single target. But that's just by reading the text. What we want to do now is to do some simulation to see how it works in practice. So what I've done is I've simulated the character I have on the PTR with each of the 5 legendaries in turn, as well as with nothing at all to provide a base, but more about that later. And I've simulated myself for different situations. First of all, single target, pure single target. Some raid bosses are just that. Or at least it's our single target damage that matters the most. I've also simulated for what is called a Beast Lord fight. This is where you are largely single target focused, but there will be periodic adds that need to be AoE down as well. Now there's 2 values I'm putting for this one. First of all, there is the AoE damage that we will do, but second of all, the focus on the boss still, because even on a fight where there's periodic adds, maybe we still want to make a decision based upon our damage to the boss. Finally, there's a Hectic Add Cleave. This is just for when it's all out AoE. This will be for like trash, but more specifically for in dungeons, to see which will be the best ones then. We may, of course, use different legendaries if you have access to different legendaries in different situations. Now, the final one is a curious one. As I mentioned before, the trinket we absolutely will be wanting from Nighthold is Convergence of Fates. It's so crucial. However, until you get that, you will be having to use whatever are the best trinkets you have. All the sims I'm doing for this, you know, the single target, the Beast Lord, the Hectic Add Cleave, are all done with the Conversion of Fates trinket. They're also done with the 4-set Nighthold armor set, by the way. However, I've also done just a single target sim without Convergence of Fate trinket, but it does still include the 4-set tier 19. Because it may take some time for people to get that trinket. It drops off the penultimate boss in the instance, and it will be highly desirable for quite a lot of players. So unless you get lucky with a coin roll, it might be some time before you can get that trinket. Here is the table in all its misplaced glory in terms of what I simmed on my character. Now what I did, just to convert this so you're not having to plug through the numbers, I did another table where I just expressed the DPS from each one in terms of percentage based on having no legendary at all. Now what we can see here is in terms of the straightforward order, for all of these, Chain of Thrain is the best legendary to get. It has now become our BIS, and it's quite clear as well. I'm actually going to go out on a limb here and say this is not even going to have anything to do with the particular gear your character has. I'm confident that sim any character with reasonable gear, and you will find that the belt, Chain of Thrain, is your best legendary. If you have it, equip it at all times. It's better for single target, it's better for AoE, it's better for a mix of single target and AoE. It's just better, and it's quite a lot better. So much so that some rets think that this will be nerfed soon after launch. The launch of the patch, that is. It may be. Be aware of that, it may be. But it's so much more powerful at the moment that it is definitely the one you want to equip. After that, it becomes a little bit, it goes in twos. The next two are Whisper of the Nathrazim, the cloak, and Liadrin's Fury Unleashed, the ring. Now it always works this way round. For single target damage, the cloak, Whisper of the Nathrazim, is a bit better than Liadrin's Fury Unleashed. For AoE situations, the ring, Liadrin's Fury Unleashed, is better. So if you've got access to those three legendaries, what you're going to do is when single target is your focus, you're going to use Chain of Thrain and Whisper of the Nathrazim. When AoE is your focus, you're going to use Chain of Thrain and Liadrin's Fury Unleashed. Now let's say you don't have access to those, but you've got access to the other two. Ashes to Dust, the shoulder, is better than Kil'jaeden's Burning Wish, the trinket, in single target situations. In AoE situations, it's the other way around. So what you want to do is to think about what is more important, my single target DPS or my AoE DPS. If single target is your most important, then as I say, if it's between the shoulders and the trinket, shoulders wins out on single target, trinket wins out on AoE. As long as you're using the trinket correctly, by the way. Because it's an on-use thing, there is an element of sort of skill introduced to it that isn't there with something that has a passive effect. When it comes to the cloak and the ring, just to summarise there, single target, take the cloak, AoE, take the ring. So there we are with legendaries. If you don't have access to any of those 5 legendaries, you're just going to have to use whatever will give you the best stats. Sephir's a secret, okay, in some situations. If you can interrupt or crowd control, it'll give you a boost of DPS. The other ones, not so much. The boots, you know, arguably useful. It makes you a little bit faster. Maybe for moving between targets can be useful. But you're just going to have to judge the other legendaries on their utility benefit. The wrists are always really good, I think, in terms of the cheat death mechanic there. The neck has been improved as well to give you the absorb shield more easily. I mean, it's not terrible. The only one I would say is really terrible is the helm. But in dungeons, actually, that's not all that terrible either. One extremely important aspect of developing your character, of course, in Legion is developing your artifact. For Retribution Paladin, this is the Ashbringer. However, I'm not going to cover that here because I've done a specific video for this. So if you look in the Retribution Paladin playlist, which is linked in the card in the top right, and look up developing your Ashbringer. The reason I'm not going to put it here is, first of all, it would be duplication. There is no change with patch 7.1.5. The second thing is that there are going to be changes to the Ashbringer coming in 7.2, and I don't want to have to redo this guide simply for that if there are no other changes. Now, other frequently asked questions tend to involve the order hall. People will often ask, which upgrade should I get? So I'm just going to go through the options and say what I would prefer. So in the first row, you have a choice between increasing the chance for quest rewards to upgrade to rare or epic, or increasing the success chance of the first mission you send out each day by 20%. There is no competition here. You take the second one to increase the mission success chance. Upgrading quest rewards only works while you're leveling, really. You don't really get much gear from quest rewards. Even the level cap quest rewards are likely to be superseded by things that you can get even in LFR or Mythic Dungeons. On the second row down, we have access to an Argent Charger hitching post, which allows us to summon a charger to be able to do mounted combat once per day. Or we have, again, something that increases the success chance of certain types of mission. Now, in my view, we get most of our order hall benefit from the missions. You even get gear from missions. You get, when you've got your champions at high enough item level, they will be able to go on missions that will give you a quest to go into either a mythic dungeon or even a raid and get gear that comes from that dungeon or raid. So anything that increases the success chance there against what, for my money, is just a bit of fun with very little, if any, practical use, always go for that. So for the second row, I would go for Righteous Blessing, which increases your success chance on missions with spells. Now, the third row down could be either or. I would certainly say in the first instance to go for the second option, which allows you to place work orders for your champion armaments. While you are developing your champions, you want to be giving them good armaments that can either increase their success chance, or if you're taking a champion out as a bodyguard, when you complete world quests, will give you order resources or gold, whichever you would prefer. That is my preference. It's the one I still have now. Now, the other one is not necessarily bad. It increases the maximum number of squires, shield bearers, knights, and templar you can recruit by 1. In theory, this allows you to send out most missions. However, in practice, I don't find myself even using the full complement of all the additional troops that I can use anyway. So I personally don't use that one. But if you find that it would be useful for you, and you've developed your champion so you don't need the armament so much anymore, then by all means go for this one. The fourth tier down, we have a choice between upgrading squads of squires into shield bearer phalanx. That increases their chance on missions by 5%, so it's an increase in mission chance, got to be good. The alternative is increasing the success chance on missions by 15% when squires or shield bearers are taken there. Now, in this particular case, it can be very much up to you. I would tend to favour the second one in most cases, Templar of the Silver Hand, increase success chance of missions by 15% when you go with squires or shield bearers. The reason for that is the other one is only increasing your mission success by 5%. When it comes down to the fifth tier, we have a choice between being able to place a work order for Silver Hand orders. What this allows us to do is to instantly complete a non-elite world quest on your map once every 18 hours. This is actually not all that beneficial. All of the really tricky world quests that might take you some time, it won't work on anyway. It will only work on the ones that are done quite easily. So you'd have to be very tight on time to benefit from this one. The alternative is allowing you to place a work order that will give you one of your 3 weekly seals of Broken Fate in exchange for a few order resources. This is definitely preferable. It will save you a considerable amount of either order resources or gold, depending on what you use to buy your fate tokens. I'd definitely go for this one. And then the last one, of course, is allowing you to upgrade the number of slots you can fill with a legendary by 1. So you can wear 2 legendaries instead of 1. You want to get that as quickly as possible. In patch 10.1.5, they're actually making it quicker. So if at the moment you're still building up your Paladin, you've only just rolled it recently, and you're thinking, oh, it's going to be ages before I can actually equip a second legendary, actually you'll find that when the patch comes out, it'll be a little bit quicker. Now, when it comes to champions, you can have 5 active only, but you get a choice of 8. And until you've reduced it down to 5, you'll not be able to carry out any missions. Now, the 5 that are recommended for Paladins are Arator the Redeemer, Daedalus Moonfang, Lady Liadrin, Lord Maxus Tyrosus, and Lothraxion. These 5 cover the traits that you're going to find useful. They've also got a couple of very useful bodyguards in there. I personally prefer taking Arator the Redeemer if I'm going to take a bodyguard out with me. So he is the one that I put my useful equipment slots on for gaining order hall resources, in my case, when I complete world quests. So that's the recommendation for which champions you should keep. So when it comes to useful macros and add-ons, I'm going to go through macros first of all. Now, there are a few you may wish to use. One feature of all Paladins is that we do have a few utility abilities that may be used on other people. This can include Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Freedom, Cleanse Toxins, Lay on Hands, and so on. Now, when it comes to wanting to use one of these on a fellow party or raid member, we don't really want to have to click them on the raid or party frames and then use the ability, because we're taking our focus off our target, which means we're reducing our damage. So what we ideally want to do is to use a mouse over macro. Now, this is how we construct a mouse over macro. If you type in the following into your macros area, this will produce a mouse over macro for Cleanse Toxins. Now,
The same sort of principle can be used to make mouse over macros for as many abilities as you like. However, because there are several for paladins, this could actually take up several macro slots. And if you find yourself a little bit tight on space, you might actually be better using an add-on called Clique, which I'll talk about in the add-on sections next. Another useful macro can be for using Divine Shield. When we need to use Divine Shield, if you're not using Divine Intervention especially, sometimes you might click on it, but in actual fact it doesn't go off straight away. What we might want to use here is a stop casting macro. Now this generally doesn't do that much good for Retribution Paladins because very few of our abilities are actually cast at all. However, just on the off chance, it can sometimes be useful to save your blushes, perhaps in a PvP situation if you're in the middle of casting a flash of light. By using this macro, it means as soon as we click Divine Shield, it will automatically stop casting anything else we might be doing at the time. It cancels it and goes straight for the Divine Shield. Finally, one that can be useful is if we have a trinket such as Faulty Countermeasure or Horn of Valor that we want to link with our Crusade or Avenging Wrath, then you can use a macro so they fire them off at the same time. Now macros like this only work if the abilities you're putting into them are what's called off the global cooldown. Now both Avenging Wrath and the trinket uses are off the global cooldown, so by macroing them together it means they will fire off at exactly the same time. Sometimes you might see people putting in macros with other things in as well, such as potion use or a Templar's Verdict. I would strongly recommend not doing that because you don't always want to be able to do those at the same time. In this particular case, I've put the use Faulty Countermeasure because that is the BIS trinket. You could just put in use Horn of Valor as well. You could actually also put in the name of the item slot. However, I don't recommend that because sometimes you might put the trinket in a different slot and then the macro will not work properly. So when it comes to add-ons, these are the following add-ons that I favour, but I'm not suggesting you get all of these, but you can pick and choose as necessary, but I think they are all really useful, especially for raiding. Now the first one is some way to track cooldowns. It's very, very important you know exactly when cooldowns are going to come off. It's also important you know when things are procced and again how long you've got of that proc lasting. For this I use Tell Me When. It's nice and easy to use, nice and easy to set up. However, you may wish to use weak auras. I would certainly recommend getting the add-on weak auras either way because sometimes people will give you weak auras that you can import into it really easily and you can do it in game that will be useful for certain fights. In my add-ons playlist I have got details of how to use Tell Me When, although not weak auras because I don't use that myself, I just take it for when other people give me them. Hekilia is a very useful and customizable rotation helper. It's very good for tracking your abilities. Before Hekilia was developed properly for Legion, I was using Tell Me When to do the same job. Hekilia allows you to do it in a much smaller space, is much tidier. Elv UI is a way of customizing your UI. There are very few options in the default Blizzard UI to be able to customize the way your screen is and where all your frames are. This one allows you to do it very well, makes it much tidier. I know mine isn't particularly tidy. I deliberately make it ugly to stop people asking for it. But I've also done a guide on how to set this up as well. MSBT is the add-on that allows me to put my combat text out to the sides. It allows me to place it wherever I want on the screen. So it means that I don't just have to turn combat text off. I can actually just move it somewhere else so it's not in my way, but it's still there if I want to see it on a video playback. Angry Assignments is extremely useful for organised raiding. It's a little note that I've got in the top left. You can position it wherever you like, so that the raid leader can send notes out to remind you of important jobs to do during the fight. Speaking of raid boss fights, it's always useful to have raid boss add-ons. Bigwigs and DBM are the most popular. I personally prefer Bigwigs, there's more customizable features in it. But either way, you should get one of them. It'll include, amongst other things, timers for important events that are going to occur in the raid. Speaking of boss tools, Exorcist raid tools also contain several useful abilities as well. Clique is the add-on I was talking about earlier with the macros. This allows you to set up effectively mouse over macros for as many abilities you like, and it only takes up a couple of macro slots. So if you're a class such as Paladin that has a number of abilities that you might want to incorporate into a mouse over macro, this allows you to do it really easily, and I've got a guide on the add-on section as well. Finally, Simulation Craft. I've talked about simulating your character quite a lot, and I thoroughly recommend you do this. The Simulation Craft add-on does not allow you to simulate your character in game or anything like that, but what it does give you is a nice, easy profile to import into Simulation Craft program itself. I have got a guide on how to use Simulation Craft, both the add-on and Simulation Craft itself. The add-on, of course, is in the add-ons playlist. The Simulation Craft guide is in my Raidcraft playlist, so check that out as well. And that's my 7.1.5 Retribution guide. Now, of course, you may well have further questions. I'm going to go through now the different ways in which you can get very specific help for yourself. Now, in terms of contacting me, you could contact me with, for example, logs of your performance, preferably video as well. I am quite happy to do videos on analysing your performance and suggesting improvements. I've done this quite recently. You'll be able to see examples of this if you check out my playlist as well. I would strongly recommend you check my playlist for other help as well. I don't just cover Retribution Paladin specific things. I cover more general raid advice as well. Look at the playlist and see what's of interest to you. I'll also do live Retribution Q&As on Twitch every so often. There'll be one of those coming up as soon as I put this one out quite soon. But always check out, if you follow me on Twitter, I'll give you advance notice of when that's going to be. I'll also be expanding my streaming going into 2017 as well. If you want to see on my Twitch account, I've linked it here. If you want more general community help, Discord is a really useful community forum. I've put a link in the description below that will allow you to get an invite onto the Hammer of Wrath, which is the Paladin Discord, and there are specific sections in there for Retribution. In fact, I would say there are more Retribution Paladins on there than any other, but it is all segmented, so you can see where you'll be able to ask for help there. So I hope you found this guide useful. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share. It's very much appreciated. And don't forget to check out my more specialised guides in the Retribution Paladin playlist as well. More will be added as Legion goes on, and I'll also be removing ones that are a bit more out of date. That playlist will always, as I said at the start, be kept with up-to-date videos only. So until next time, I'll see you later.